Hi, this is Andrew. Today I want to talk to you about Jacob Arminius, the theologian who reshaped Protestant thought. This is the second video in a four-part series on Jacob Arminius. If you haven't watched the first video in this series, go to our website, our rumble.com account, or our youtube.com account. After Arminius' death in 1609, his followers collected and published his works, including his lectures, disputations, and other writings. These posthumous publications helped to preserve and propagate his theological legacy, even as the controversy surrounding his ideas continued to intensify. The most significant of these publications was the Opera Theologica, a comprehensive collection of Arminius' theological works that appeared in 1629. To understand Arminius' theological significance, it is helpful to organize his thought around several key themes that formed the core of his theological system. While he addressed nearly every aspect of Christian theology, these themes represent his most distinctive contributions and the areas where he most clearly departed from prevailing Calvinist orthodoxy. At the heart of Arminius' theology was his understanding of God's sovereignty. Unlike the Calvinist view, which tended to define sovereignty primarily in terms of God's deterministic control over all events, Arminius conceived of sovereignty as God's perfect wisdom and power in accomplishing his purposes. For Arminius, a sovereign God was not one who unconditionally determined all things, but rather one who was able to achieve his will through the free choices of his creatures. This understanding of sovereignty led Arminius to reject what he saw as the deterministic implications of Calvinist theology. He argued that if God unconditionally determined all human actions, including sinful ones, then God would be the author of sin, a conclusion he found incompatible with the biblical portrait of God as holy and just. Instead, he maintained that God's sovereignty was compatible with genuine human freedom, and that God was able to accomplish his purposes through the free choices of human beings. Arminius' doctrine of election was perhaps the most controversial aspect of his theology. He rejected the Calvinist notion of unconditional election, arguing instead that election was conditional. For Arminius, God chose to save those whom he foreknew would believe in Christ. This foreknowledge was not based on God's determination of human choices, but rather on his perfect knowledge of what those choices would be. Arminius distinguished between different aspects of election. He spoke of God's general election of all people to salvation, an election based on God's universal desire for all to be saved. He also spoke of God's particular election of individuals to salvation, an election based on God's foreknowledge of who would believe. And he spoke of God's election of believers to glory, an election based on God's gracious purpose to bring to completion the work he had begun in them. This understanding of election allowed Arminius to maintain both God's sovereignty in salvation and human responsibility. God was sovereign in that he initiated the work of salvation and provided the grace necessary for faith. Humans were responsible in that they could freely accept or reject that grace. Arminius' view of human freedom was another key aspect of his theological system. He rejected the Calvinist notion that human will was bound by sin and unable to choose contrary to God's grace. Instead, he maintained that human beings, though affected by sin, retained the ability to make free choices. Arminius distinguished between different kinds of freedom. He spoke of natural freedom, the ability to choose according to one's desires, even if those desires are sinful. He also spoke of moral freedom, the ability to choose between good and evil. In their natural state, humans possessed natural freedom but lacked moral freedom. Through grace, however, God restored moral freedom, enabling humans to choose righteousness. This understanding of human freedom was crucial for Arminius' theology of salvation. If humans were unable to choose contrary to God's grace, then salvation would be determined solely by God's decree, and human responsibility would be illusory. By affirming genuine human freedom, Arminius preserved the integrity of human responsibility while maintaining the necessity of divine grace. Arminius's understanding of grace was central to his theological system. He affirmed the Reformed emphasis on the necessity of grace for salvation, teaching that humans could not save themselves or even believe apart from God's gracious work. However, he rejected the Calvinist notion of irresistible grace, arguing instead that grace could be resisted by human beings. For Arminius, grace was not a force that overwhelmed human will, but rather a gracious influence that enabled human will. He spoke of prevenient grace, the grace that goes before and prepares human hearts to receive the gospel. This grace was universal in scope, available to all people, and sufficient to enable all to believe if they chose to. Arminius also distinguished between different degrees of grace. He spoke of sufficient grace, which was enough to enable all to believe, and efficacious grace, which was the grace that actually brought about salvation in those who believed. This distinction allowed him to maintain both the sufficiency of God's grace and the genuineness of human choice. One of the pastoral concerns that motivated Arminius's theological development was the question of assurance. He struggled with how to comfort believers who were anxious about their salvation. If election was unconditional and unknowable, how could sincere Christians find assurance of their salvation? Arminius addressed this concern by emphasizing the present reality of faith and obedience as the basis for assurance. He taught that believers could be assured of their salvation not by looking to an eternal decree, but by examining their present relationship with Christ. If they were currently trusting in Christ and living in obedience to Him, they could be assured of their present salvation and of God's gracious purpose to bring them to glory. This understanding of assurance provided a pastoral solution to the problem of anxiety while maintaining the importance of perseverance in faith. It emphasized the present reality of salvation rather than speculation about eternal decrees, and it encouraged believers to focus on their relationship with Christ rather than on abstract theological concepts. On the relationship between faith and works, Arminius took a mediating position between what he saw as the extremes of antinomianism and legalism. He affirmed the Reformed principle of justification by faith alone, but he emphasized that genuine faith always produced good works. For Arminius, faith and works were distinct but inseparable. Faith was the root of salvation, while works were the necessary fruit of that salvation. He rejected what he saw as the antinomian implications of some forms of Protestant teaching, insisting that genuine faith would always produce a transformed life. This understanding of the relationship between faith and works had important pastoral implications. It encouraged believers to pursue holiness not as a means of earning salvation, but as the natural response to the salvation they had already received by faith. It also provided a basis for Christian assurance, as believers could look to the fruit of their lives as evidence of the reality of their faith. The theological positions developed by Arminius during his lifetime sparked intense controversy in the Dutch Reformed Church and beyond. This controversy would come to a head at the Synod of Dort, 1618 to 1619. A major church council convened to address the Arminian controversy and to determine the official doctrine of the Dutch Reformed Church. After Arminius's death in 1609, his followers continued to develop and promote his theological views. In 1610, they presented a document to the States of Holland known as the Remonstrance, which summarized their theological positions in 5 key points. These points, often referred to as the 5 Articles of the Remonstrance, can be summarized as follows. 1. Conditional election. God chooses to save those whom He foreknew would believe. 2. Universal atonement. Christ died for all people, though only believers actually receive the benefits of His death. 3. Total depravity. Humans are incapable of saving themselves apart from God's grace. 4. Resistible grace. God's grace can be resisted by human beings. 5. The possibility of apostasy. True believers can fall away from faith and lose their salvation. These 5 points represented the core of Arminian theology and would become the focus of the controversy that led to the Synod of Dort. In response to the Remonstrance, the Calvinist theologians developed their own summary of doctrine, known as the Counter-Remonstrance. This document defended the traditional Calvinist positions on the same 5 points, articulating what would later become known as the 5 points of Calvinism, or the TULIP acronym. 1. Total depravity. Humans are incapable of saving themselves apart from God's grace. 2. Unconditional election. God chooses to save some people unconditionally, based solely on his sovereign will. 3. Limited atonement. Christ died only for the elect. 4. Irresistible grace. God's grace cannot be resisted by those whom he has chosen to save. 5. Perseverance of the saints. True believers cannot fall away from faith, but will persevere to the end. The theological debate between the Remonstrance and the Counter-Remonstrance would dominate Dutch religious and political life for the next decade, eventually leading to the convening of the Synod of Dort. The Synod of Dort was convened by the States General of the Netherlands in 1618 to address the Arminian controversy and to establish the official doctrine of the Dutch Reformed Church. The Synod included delegates from Reformed churches across Europe, as well as representatives of the Dutch government. It was a major international event, with implications for the future of Protestantism far beyond the borders of the Netherlands. The Synod began by examining the 5 articles of the Remonstrance and the theological positions of the Remonstrant leaders. After months of careful deliberation and debate, the Synod rejected the Arminian positions and affirmed the Calvinist doctrines of unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and the perseverance of the saints. The decisions of the Synod were summarized in the Canons of Dort, which became one of the 3 major confessional standards of the Dutch Reformed Church, along with the Belgic Confession and the Heidelberg Catechism. The Synod also took action against the Remonstrant leaders. Johannes Wijdenbogert, one of the leading Remonstrants, was deprived of his office and exiled. Other Remonstrant ministers were removed from their positions and required to sign the Canons of Dort. Those who refused were persecuted and, in some cases, imprisoned. The decisions of the Synod of Dort had profound and lasting consequences for the Dutch Reformed Church and for Protestant theology more broadly. In the Netherlands, the Arminians were forced to establish their own separate denomination, known as the Remonstrant Brotherhood. This denomination would continue to exist alongside the Calvinist Dutch Reformed Church, providing an alternative expression of Reformed theology for those who found the Calvinist position untenable. Beyond the Netherlands, the Synod of Dort helped to solidify the Calvinist tradition within Protestantism and to define Arminianism as a distinct theological movement. The Canons of Dort became one of the most influential confessional documents in the Reformed tradition, shaping the development of Reformed theology across Europe and, eventually, around the world. At the same time, the Arminian tradition continued to develop and spread, particularly in England and, later, in America. The theological positions articulated by Arminius and his followers would find new expression in the Methodist movement and in other traditions that emphasize human freedom and responsibility in salvation. To fully appreciate Arminius's theological contributions, it is important to understand the religious landscape in which he lived and worked. The 16th and 17th centuries were a period of intense religious ferment, marked by the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and numerous theological controversies that shaped the future of Christianity. The Protestant Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther in 1517, had fundamentally transformed the religious landscape of Europe by challenging the authority of the Catholic Church and introducing new theological perspectives on salvation, Scripture, and the Church. By the time Arminius was born in 1560, the Reformation had split Western Christianity into various Protestant traditions, Lutheran, Reformed, Anabaptist, and others, each with its own distinctive theological emphases. The Reformed tradition, which would become Arminius's theological home, traced its origins to Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich and John Calvin in Geneva. Calvin's theology, in particular, had a profound influence on the development of Reformed thought, especially through his magisterial work, Institutes of the Christian Religion, and through the network of Reformed churches and academies that he helped to establish across Europe. The Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation, known as the Counter-Reformation, also shaped the religious context in which Arminius worked. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, which defined Catholic doctrine in response to Protestant challenges, had clarified the Catholic positions on justification, the sacraments, the authority of tradition, and other key theological issues. The Catholic Church had also renewed its emphasis on spiritual formation, particularly through new religious orders like the Jesuits, who played a key role in defending and spreading Catholicism. This Catholic renewal posed a significant challenge to Protestantism, particularly in the Netherlands, which remained a contested territory between Protestant and Catholic forces. The religious conflict in the Netherlands was not merely theological, but also political, as the Dutch struggled to establish their independence from Catholic Spain and to define their national identity in religious terms. Another important development in the religious landscape of the 16th and 17th centuries was the rise of Protestant scholasticism. This movement sought to systematize Protestant theology using the philosophical methods of medieval scholasticism, particularly the logic and metaphysics of Aristotle. Protestant scholasticism aimed to provide a comprehensive and rational defense of Protestant doctrine against Catholic criticisms and to establish a coherent theological system that could serve as the foundation for Protestant education and ministry. Calvinist scholasticism, in particular, had a significant influence on the development of Reformed theology in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Figures like Theodore Beza, Franciscus Junius, and Gisbertus Voetius sought to articulate and defend Calvinist doctrine with philosophical precision, often emphasizing the sovereignty of God and the determinism of divine providence. Arminius was educated in this scholastic tradition and was familiar with its methods and assumptions. However, he grew increasingly critical of what he saw as the excessive rationalism and determinism of some forms of Protestant scholasticism, particularly as they related to the doctrines of predestination and grace. His theological project can be seen, in part, as an attempt to reform the Reformed tradition from within, preserving its essential insights while correcting what he saw as its philosophical excesses. The religious climate in the Netherlands during Arminius's lifetime was particularly volatile. The Netherlands had been a center of Protestant activity since the early days of the Reformation, and it had experienced intense persecution under Spanish rule. The Dutch revolt against Spain, 1568 to 1648, was motivated in part by religious concerns, as the Dutch sought to establish Protestantism and to free themselves from Catholic Spanish domination. By the time Arminius began his theological career, the northern provinces of the Netherlands had established their independence as the Dutch Republic and had made Calvinism the official state religion. However, religious uniformity was not easily achieved, and the Dutch Reformed Church was characterized by a significant theological diversity and conflict. The controversy between Arminius and his opponents must be understood against this backdrop of religious and political turmoil. Despite the condemnation of his views at the Synod of Dort, Arminius's theological ideas continued to exert influence long after his death. The Arminian tradition developed and spread, particularly in England and America, where it shaped the theology and practice of numerous denominations and movements. Today, Arminianism remains a vital and influential theological tradition within Christianity, with millions of adherents around the world. In the immediate aftermath of the Synod of Dort, Arminius's followers in the Netherlands established their own denomination, known as the Remonstrant Brotherhood. This denomination provided a home for those who could not accept the Calvinist doctrines articulated at Dort, but who wished to remain within the broader Reformed tradition. The Remonstrant Brotherhood developed a distinctive theology and church culture that reflected Arminius's emphasis on God's love, human freedom, and the responsibility of believers. They placed a strong emphasis on personal piety and practical Christianity, seeking to live out their faith in ways that made a tangible difference in society. They also valued education and critical thinking, establishing schools and seminaries that promoted intellectual openness and theological inquiry. Despite facing persecution and discrimination in the 17th century, the Remonstrant Brotherhood survived and eventually gained legal recognition in the Netherlands. Today, it remains a small but influential denomination, known for its progressive theology and its commitment to social justice and interfaith dialogue. Arminian ideas found a receptive audience in England, particularly within the Church of England. Theologians like John Overall, Thomas Jackson, and Henry Hammond promoted Arminian views on predestination, grace, and human freedom, often in opposition to the prevailing Calvinist orthodoxy of the English Reformation. The Arminian movement in England reached its peak during the reign of Charles I, when William Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury, sought to enforce religious uniformity and to promote a more sacramental and liturgical form of worship. Laud and his allies were often accused of Arminianism by their Puritan opponents, who saw their emphasis on free will and human responsibility as a departure from Reformed orthodoxy. The theological controversy between Arminians and Calvinists in England became intertwined with political conflicts, contributing to the tensions that eventually led to the English Civil War. After the Restoration, the Church of England moved in a more Arminian direction, with the Book of Common Prayer and the 39 Articles reflecting a more moderate theological stance that left room for both Calvinist and Arminian interpretations. Perhaps the most significant development in the history of Arminianism was its association with the Methodist movement, founded by John Wesley in the 18th century. Wesley, an Anglican priest, was deeply influenced by Arminian theology, particularly through his reading of the works of Arminius's followers and his interaction with the Moravians. Wesley's theology was characterized by a strong emphasis on God's grace, human freedom, and the responsibility of believers. He taught that predestination was conditional, that Christ died for all people, that grace could be resisted, and that believers could fall from grace. These positions, which closely mirrored those of Arminius, formed the theological foundation of Methodism and would eventually shape the theology of numerous other denominations and movements. Wesley's ministry had a profound impact on English religious life and, through his missionary efforts, on American Christianity as well. The Methodist movement grew rapidly, particularly among the working classes, and it emphasized personal holiness, social reform, and missionary activity. Wesley's Arminian theology provided the theological framework for these emphases, encouraging believers to respond to God's grace and to work out their salvation in practical ways. Arminianism had a significant influence on American Christianity, particularly through the Methodist and Baptist traditions. The Methodist Episcopal Church, established in America in the late 18th century, was explicitly Arminian in its theology, and it quickly became one of the largest denominations in the United States. The Baptist tradition also showed significant Arminian influence, particularly through the General Baptists, who taught that Christ died for all people and that individuals could freely accept or reject God's grace. While the particular Baptists maintained a more Calvinist theology, the General Baptists and their theological descendants played an important role in shaping American Baptist identity. The revival movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly the Second Great Awakening and the Holiness Movement, also reflected Arminian influences. These movements emphasized human responsibility in salvation, the possibility of entire sanctification, and the need for personal conversion, themes that resonated with Arminian theology. Today, Arminianism remains a vital and influential theological tradition within Christianity. It is the official or dominant theology of numerous denominations, including the Methodist, Wesleyan, Nazarene, Pentecostal, and many Baptist churches. It also has significant support within other traditions, including the Anglican/Episcopal, Lutheran, and even some Reformed churches. Contemporary Arminian theologians have continued to develop and refine Arminian theology, engaging with modern philosophical and scientific challenges and articulating Arminian insights in new contexts. Figures like Thomas Oden, Clark Pinnock, and Roger Olson have sought to retrieve and renew the Arminian tradition, presenting it as a viable alternative to both Calvinist determinism and liberal theology. The theological positions articulated by Jacob Arminius more than 4 centuries ago continue to have relevance and significance for contemporary Christianity. The issues he addressed, God's sovereignty, human freedom, the nature of grace, the assurance of salvation, remains central to Christian theology and practice, and his insights continue to inform and shape these discussions. One of the most persistent challenges to Christian faith is the problem of evil and suffering. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? The Arminian emphasis on human freedom provides a framework for addressing this problem that avoids the deterministic implications of some forms of Calvinism. For Arminians, evil and suffering are not the result of God's sovereign decree, but rather the consequence of human misuse of freedom. God created humans with a genuine ability to choose, and He allows them to exercise that freedom, even when they choose wrongly. This understanding of human freedom preserves both God's goodness and human responsibility, providing a response to the problem of evil that is both theologically coherent and pastorally sensitive. Arminian theology also has significant implications for the mission of the Church. If Christ died for all people, and if all can be saved, then the Church has a compelling motive for evangelism and mission. The Arminian emphasis on universal atonement and resistible grace encourages believers to share the gospel with all people, trusting that God's grace is sufficient to save all who respond in faith. This missionary impulse has been a hallmark of Arminian traditions, particularly Methodism and Pentecostalism. These movements have been characterized by a strong emphasis on evangelism and missions, seeking to fulfill the Great Commission by making disciples of all nations. The Arminian understanding of God's salvific will provide the theological foundation for this missionary zeal. Arminian theology also supports a strong commitment to social justice and ethics. If humans are genuinely free and responsible for their choices, then they are accountable for the social and political structures they create and maintain. The Arminian emphasis on human responsibility encourages believers to work for justice and righteousness in society, seeking to align human institutions with God's purposes. This social ethic has been evident in Arminian traditions throughout history. The Methodists, for example, were known for their opposition to slavery, their support for workers' rights, and their concern for the poor and marginalized. Similarly, the social gospel movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries drew heavily on Arminian insights, emphasizing the responsibility of Christians to work for the transformation of society. Arminian theology also has important implications for spiritual formation and discipleship. If believers can fall from grace, then perseverance in faith is not automatic, but requires intentional effort and spiritual discipline. The Arminian emphasis on human responsibility encourages believers to take their spiritual growth seriously, engaging in practices that nurture their relationship with God and strengthen their faith. This completes the second video in this video series. To watch the third video in this series, or to watch more videos like this one, you can go to our website at nehemiahreset.org, to our rumble.com or youtube.com channels. We publish new videos weekly. You can also sign up to receive our weekly new video list by going to nehemiahreset.org/email and sign up for our weekly newsletter. To help our channel, please like and subscribe so that more people can see these important videos. Thanks for watching and have a great day. Are you looking for a limitless supply of insightful reads to expand your mind and transform your life? Look no further than Nehemiah Reset's ebook library, where knowledge meets inspiration at nehemiahreset.org ebook. Go there today to discover a wealth of valuable resources to help you on your personal and professional journey to build a biblical worldview. Learn more about the Bible and how culture is impacting your worldview. Again, the ebook library is located at nehemiahreset.org ebook. Hope to see you soon. My name is Andrew. I am one of the spokespersons for Nehemiah Reset. The prior video was sponsored by Nehemiah Reset, a 501c3. Our mission is to assist Christians in developing a biblical worldview as it pertains to relevant cultural and biblical issues. We seek to inform Christ's followers, equip them, and mobilize them in action to vote for their biblical values and actively engage in our We are also committed to help Christians and non-believers to develop a better biblical view. Nehemiah Reset produces videos and ebooks to assist members of the church in developing a biblical worldview when it comes to cultural issues. We produce videos on key topics like public school indoctrination, the woke agenda, sex education, equity and inclusion, climate change, immigration, religious freedom, and much, much more. To learn more about Nehemiah Reset or to watch our latest videos, go to our website at nehemiahreset.org or our rumble.com channel. We produce 2 to 3 videos every week. To get a weekly list of our latest videos, sign up for our weekly newsletter by going to nehemiahreset.org/email and subscribe. You can support our website by liking our videos, subscribing to our channels, or helping us reach more people through tax-exempt donations. Thanks for your help in growing God's kingdom and bringing more people to Christ. Thank you for your support and help. Come back again soon. Have a great day.